How would you like to use some Tales from Elsewhere monsters in your 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons game? I met two really cool creators, August over at TTRPGenius and Anthony over at DM Dungeon Mastery, and they make custom Dungeons & Dragons monsters, taking existing ones out of the monster manual and adding more interesting mechanics, making them more dynamic and deadly. And I had a challenge for them. Take the Blood Oiler, one of my favorite creatures from the Clock World setting of Tales from Elsewhere, and convert it to 5th edition D&D. So let's hop into the meeting we had where the three of us sat down together and reviewed their creations. All right, the DM Dungeon Mastery man himself, Anthony, why don't you tell us about your channel?
Hello, I am DM Dungeon Mastery. I am pretty much known for creature stat block reworks. I tend to dive into the designs of the creatures, and I like to deep dive into the lore that Wizards of the Coast has left us for things, and really egg out some of the really niche things that creatures can do and some of their old obscure lore from older editions, and I like to just bring them into 5th edition because 5th edition is known for being super watered down. So I like to take it and kind of make it a little bit more complex, but more importantly, more interesting.
We also have the TTRPGenius himself. August, why don't you tell us about your channel?
Absolutely. My name is August with TTRPGenius, and on my channel, we like to do lore breakdowns, deep dives into monsters, and creating our own homebrew stat blocks.
I love to see it, and I'm a big fan of your Knoll rework myself. So without further ado, we are looking at the Blood Oiler. So I wanted to know, Anthony, August, what were your impressions of the Blood Oiler when we first started talking about it?
So for me, I thought it was a really cool creature. I really like the gothic horror western theme that it has going on. I like the different varying things that it could do, at least what it looks like it could do from the artwork. That's honestly one of my favorite things about the creature is the very well-made art for it. That's really helpful for, getting your creative juices flowing as somebody who likes to make a lot of stat blocks. I like to look at the art and try to imagine what can I make this creature do just by looking at its artwork.
Absolutely, yeah. Art is very powerful, and shout out to Dr. Neri, the artist behind this, because it is a fantastic work. It's gross. It has its guts and intestines hanging out. It has the rusty saw blade, which invokes that fear, and those eyes are so well done. I love the little smoke trail coming up from them.
Yeah, it's such a fun piece of artwork, and it was great seeing what I written, the written description I gave, just brought to life. It took almost no iterations with this artist to just nail this. He just got it right away. So it was super cool. Well, I'm really excited to dig into your stat block, so let's jump into that next. All right, so first up, we have DM Dungeon Mastery. Anthony, walk us through your version of the Blood Oiler.
Okay, so for my version of the Blood Oiler, I wanted to take that horror aspect that I get from the artwork and really try to bring it out. And 5th edition is really bad, in my opinion, at doing stuff like this normally. So you have to really start pulling some strings. So the first thing I did was gave it a pretty decent high AC, but I named it Grotesque Exoskeleton because if you look at the artwork, it's got this really grotesque looking mechanical structure to it. I gave it pretty decent hit points in the mid-range, so the intention is assuming there's multiple of these, and their intent is to grab somebody, take them away, and turn them into a Blood Oiler. You want to use multiple of these, but not have them with 2 insanely high hit points. Now, let's go down here into the special traits area. So damage absorption, that's going to be a really big thing with this creature. Since it's sort of an undead construct hybrid, I wanted to give it damage absorption for necrotic and lightning damage. For my design philosophy, undead that are risen with some sort of necromantic energy always absorb necrotic damage. It's a very 3.5-esque thing to do, but also I gave it the lightning damage because it's a construct. I don't know, I just feel like electricity somehow powers constructs, though it might not be completely accurate. That's just what I went with. Now, sort of just glossing over some of the other special traits, I gave it a mutable form, so it can't be polymorphed into a cute little rabbit. It's coming for your limbs no matter what you do. I gave it magic weapons so that it can still hammer through some barbarian resistances if applicable. Not usually super important, but in case it's fighting a werewolf or something, I'd like it to be able to at least try to sever the werewolf's limbs. Now, Mortal Dread, this is a really interesting one. So let's say one of your party members gets taken away by this thing, and you find them later on, and they've been turned into a Blood Oiler. I have this little familiar face bullet point under Mortal Dread. So let me go through the ability really quick. So it says when a living creature that can see the Blood Oiler does so for the first time, it makes a wisdom save. On a success, they're immune to this trait for the next 24 hours, but if they fail, they're frightened for 1 minute. But if familiar face goes off, that means if you recognize the Blood Oiler as a person that you knew, you have disadvantage on that saving throw to really hammer that point home that, oh god, this thing is terrifying. And then I gave it Juggernaut's Fortitude. I kind of stole this from Peter, to be honest with you. I'm not going to take credit for this one, but I took inspiration from an ability that he had created from his zombie. So if you deal less than 10 damage with an attack roll, you're not actually going to damage the creature, trying to just show that this thing is an unstoppable force or an immovable object, however you wish to see it. Now, we'll move into the actions here. I did give it multi-attack, and it has 4 different attacks, so that's already going to be incredibly scary for your player characters. Now, this scales up pretty hard. The more of these you put into the fight, the way more intense of a fight it's going to be. So, with my stat blocks, they are very different from how 5th edition typically does them. You'll see, if we move into my first action here, it's Iron Arm. Now, looking at the artwork, you see that giant metallic metal claw hand that it has. So that's what I'm considering to be the Iron Arm. Now, in Peter's system, you target the limbs and try to disable them. So what I did here was I gave you the option. So if you like to do things like the called shot rule, where you can target a limb and damage it and destroy it, this shows you that everything in this category will be pretty much rendered useless if you destroy this body part. Now, it's up to you on how you want to rule that. There's a ton of different homebrew ways you can do that, so I just leave it up to you, but I do have the option in there for if you destroy the Iron Arm. So let's dive into the Iron Arm here. So it's a melee weapon. It's +7 to hit. It can slam, or it can do throttling grab. Now, it's pretty iconic ability. This is the one that makes it very scary. So if you're a large or smaller humanoid or giant, it can grab you if you fail a strength save. And once it does, it's essentially holding you up in the air by the throat, and it's walking around with you. And you're being strangled. So you're going to lose, you're going to be following under the suffocation rules. So you're going to be losing oxygen if you take damage, and you're going to have to make a con save to continue holding your breath. Now, that's not the scariest ability, but it's the one that starts off the horror. Now, moving down to the saw blade arm, this is pretty much the most iconic thing on this creature, in my opinion. So I wanted to make sure that it was scary. So with the saw blade arm, you can do 2 different things. You can rend flesh or sever limb. Rend flesh is the attack that it can use when it doesn't have a creature grappled. So if it's not throttling somebody and holding them up by the throat, it can't use sever limb. So what rend flesh does is it does 2d12 slashing damage, which is a lot, and then it also gives you lacerated. Now this stacks. This is a dot that I have created. It's essentially you take 2 points of slashing damage at the end of each of your turns. Now, because it says lacerated 2, it's actually going to be 4 points of slashing damage because you have 2 stacks of this stacking dot damage, essentially. So the only way to get rid of that is by taking magical healing, or you can use a healer's kit, which is a very underutilized piece of equipment in 5th edition. So I wanted to sort of give you options with that. Now, here's the scary part. Sever limb. Now, this states that the target has to be grappled. Does 2d10 slashing damage on a hit, And then the Blood Oiler targets a limb of the creature that it's holding. It loses the use of that limb until it receives magical healing of 3rd level or higher, and if this damage would reduce the creature to 0 hit points, the limb is severed entirely, and the creature takes 1 necrotic damage at the start of each of its turns until it receives magical healing. So, if it slays that character, it chops the limb off, and then they go unconscious, and then they're going to start taking a point of necrotic damage, which will fail death saving throws. That's the important thing to remember. Now, if you're an ally of that creature, so if you just watched the Barbarian, who is typically your strong frontline character who saved the wizard many of times from a dragon or a Bule, get his arms severed off, you're going to be probably scared of that. So I made it that if you witness this event happening, you make a wisdom save, and if you fail, you're frightened of the Blood Oiler for 1 minute, repeating the save at the end of your turn to end. Now we'll move into the not the last ability yet, but we're getting there. We're getting more deadly the lower we go down on the stat block here. This is the Syringe Arm. So referencing the art yet again, it has that massive mechanical syringe that looks like it's dripping this black, oily liquid. Now, Peter had told me this was meant for disabling the creatures so that they could take them back to a lair and turn them into a Blood Oiler. So that's exactly what I wanted to make this do. So the reach for this is touch. So essentially, he has to be holding you still, but if there's another circumstance where he could use this, like if you're on the ground unconscious, he could probably use it. It's just up to you as the dungeon master. So it does 2d6 piercing damage plus 4d8 poison damage, and you have to make a con save. If you fail, you are poisoned for 1 minute. While poisoned this way, you are paralyzed, and then you can repeat the save at the end of each of your turns to end the paralysis. But you remain poisoned. That's the important part. So this stuff, whatever this liquid is that you determine it to be, it is very, very potent and very deadly. Now, if this reduces you to 0 hit points, you are stable, but you are poisoned and paralyzed for 1 hour even after regaining hit points. So whatever this liquid is that creates the Blood Oilers, it's very bad for living creatures to be injected with it. Now, we'll go to the final ability here. This is an ability that actually can be used against the Blood Oiler in a way. This is the Hydraulic Circulatory System. This is not a specific part of the creature. This is just the creature as a whole. This is what I think of when I'm looking at the pressure gauge canister kind of hanging over his shoulder with the saw blade arm. So this sort of just has to happen. So if this is off of its recharge, the Blood Oiler has to use this. So its vascular system spews oil in a 15-foot radius, so that's from it everywhere around it in a 15-foot radius. It creates difficult terrain until it's cleared. Each creature other than the Blood Oiler that starts its turn in, moves into, or within the area has to succeed on a DC 14 dex save, and if you fail, you fall prone. Now that's one part of it, but the part that can be used against the Blood Oiler is this oil does ignite upon taking fire damage, and it burns for 1 minute. So any creature in that area is going to take 3d6 fire damage at the start of each of its turns, and then the creature has to use an action while outside of the fire to extinguish the flames. So if the Blood Oiler is wreaking havoc and it's leaking oil everywhere, you can actually use that to your advantage and, fire a flaming arrow, shoot a fire spell at that oil pitch that it's just spewing around it to sort of set it alight and actually damage the Blood Oiler. And that's going to do it just about for my stat block, other than the resistances and immunities. Pretty self-explanatory. I just gave it a couple things like cold, piercing, slashing, and then lightning, necrotic, psychic, because it's an undead. It probably doesn't have really a functioning brain to be attacked, and then it has some condition immunities that would make sense for a creature like this, in my opinion.
Well, I obviously really like this stat block because something that a lot of D&D monsters lack is a truly terrifying way to attack their players. So you can have scary enemies like a big golem, hits really hard and is hard to kill, but its attacks are things like slam. And sure, the slam does a lot of damage, and you could almost see the Blood Oiler that Anthony built here as built like some of the golems. It has some special attacks, it has some special immunities, but what makes it cool is that just how gruesome it is if it gets its hands on you, right? The players should be afraid to engage this thing in melee, and in a way that just doing a lot of damage doesn't articulate. So all of these rider effects and bloody mutilations just make this thing super scary in a way that not a lot of D&D monsters do.
I have to agree with Peter on this. This is an awesome stat block. One of my favorite parts of it is the familiar face ability, where if somebody recognizes someone they know, they have disadvantage on that fear save, and that is so creative. I love that part.
That's so good. You know, when I saw that, I thought, all right, I'm going to write that down. I got to add that in Tales from Elsewhere. That's really good. I didn't think about that. I like that you also included a way to target limbs, because there are actually there's spells in D&D that specifically state they restore severed limbs, but very few things that take the limbs from the players. So gotta add in limb severing so that those regeneration spells and such actually have a use. So I really like it, because you don't really have called shots per se in D&D, so it was interesting to see how you tackled that, as that's so central to Tales from Elsewhere. So super cool. And you added something that came up in some of the playtests I had with the Blood Oiler in Tales from Elsewhere, which is the oil. Players would look at the art and try to set the oiler on fire because it's covered in oil. And because the Blood Oiler is this undead construct, it doesn't have a concept of self-preservation, so it doesn't try to put itself out. It just charges at them still, flesh burning away, like a Terminator. It's great. So we set it on fire, but then it comes out of the flames, saw blade still revving. So it's cool because it adds a way to harm it, use its own abilities against it, but it's still actually quite terrifying.
I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, that was actually something I thought was cool, and I pictured, because it kind of looks like it's a ramshackle construct in a way. It was made by other creatures that are pretty much they're not really functioning, thinking creatures. They're just kind of slamming the parts together to make a rough humanoid shape that could go then sever your limbs. So I picture, that circulatory system that's pumping this oil throughout it. It's probably not the most stable thing in the world. So I kind of thought it would be cool if it's just constantly, backfiring, spewing oil out everywhere, causing just a mess wherever it goes before it, recharges and refuels, however you would think.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a black market consumable in Tales from Elsewhere that is the blood of a blood oiler. You can actually harvest it, and it's obviously has some drawbacks to using it, but that's maybe a subject for another video. All right, well, thanks so much. That one was great. Let's hop into the next one. All right, it's time to take a look at the TTRPGenius version of this. August, take it away. Tell us about your blood oiler.
Absolutely. So when I was creating my version of the Blood Oiler, I had a lot of ideas going through my mind, and the number one thought I had is, how much do I want this to be D&D, and how much do I want this to be Tales from Elsewhere and Clock World? And I settled somewhere in the middle, and I think you guys are going to see where those come in. So if we take a look starting down, it just has a natural armor. I gave it a 15, and I kept it at CR4. I wanted it to still be a deadly creature for low-level play, but something that when you are experiencing it as a higher-level player, it's still going to be deadly. I gave it Undead Fortitude, the standard one that most zombies get, as well as a Rusty build. The Blood Oiler has advantage on saving throws against being paralyzed or stunned, making it so it's a little bit harder to skip its turn in combat. It has the Menacing Saw ability. While the saw blade arm isn't incapacitated, each creature within 60 feet of it must make a DC 13 Wisdom saving throw or become frightened for 1 minute. A frightened target can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, with disadvantage if the blood oil is within line of sight, ending the effect on itself on a success. If the target succeeds on a saving throw, it's immune to the Menacing Saw for 24 hours. And then a separate ability. I was really thinking about keeping these one ability, but Menacing Saw was kind of getting a little too long for my liking. And this actually gives it an additional ability that we'll go into here in a moment. But Maiming Terror, when the Blood Oiler dismembers a creature using its Saw Blade arm attack, each creature within 30 feet of it must succeed on a DC 16 saving throw or become frightened for 1d6 rounds. So this doesn't work with the Menacing Saw. This is its own unique saving throw. So those who are immune to Menacing Saw, seeing their teammates, their friends, even a random citizen, if this is inside of a town or something, being dismembered, and it's a higher DC. It's a 16. So for levels 2, 3, 4, when you're going to be encountering this Blood Oiler, and even for higher levels, it's still a high saving throw. Next, I gave it Limb Vulnerability. This is my way of blending Tales from Elsewhere Clock World and D&D 5e. So, a creature can take a -5 penalty to the attack roll to aim for one of the Blood Oiler's arms. Each limb has 22 hit points, and when I was looking at that, I was thinking, how am I going to choose how much hit points each limb is going to have? And my thought process, especially looking at this art, is most of its physical body is its arms. It doesn't have a lot for the midsection. It's a gaping hole. Its guts are spilling out. Its legs, it's got some meat there, but for the most part, it's those arms. And so it actually takes most of those hit points away from its hit point total. So it's 3d8 plus 9, which is its constitution bonus for each of those d8s. And then when a limb is reduced to 0 hit points, it becomes incapacitated, meaning it can't use that limb anymore. Damage dealt to the limb is also done to the Blood Oiler, just added to make it a little bit more clear when people are looking. So that way, when a DM is running it and their players are like, well, is this damaging the body or is this its own health pool? It would be so powerful because that's an additional 66 hit points. So that puts it well above 140 right there. And that's too strong for CR4 unless this is just an armored tank that can't do anything. Next, we get into its attacks, and I really wanted to captivate that horror. In fact, when I was looking into the Blood Oiler, reading through its stat block that is provided in Tales from Elsewhere, and from all the lore that Peter has put out, I wanted to incorporate some of those abilities in here. So the Saw Blade arm attack, it deals 13 slashing damage, and if it hits and deals equal to half the target's hit point maximum or more, and those who play 4th edition or use the bloodied mechanic, it's essentially if it bloodies you or it scores a critical hit, the target loses a limb of the Blood Oiler's choosing as it saws through. And I added in there that it is painfully removed. And next, to kind of go along with that, we're going to skip Syringe. We'll come right back to that. But we're going to go down to the Choking Grasp attack. This is how it's going to really make sure it can land those big hits and cut your player's arms off. It is a basic attack. It deals 6 bludgeoning damage as it grabs the target by the neck. And as I was looking into the lore and everything that we had, it's a nearly inescapable grasp. So I bumped it up to DC 18 to escape. You have a friend helping you out, or if you incapacitate the arm, that's going to be your best bet, because especially at levels 3, 4, and 5, when you're encountering this the most, that's going to be a tough one to break out of. The target's going to be restrained and it can no longer breathe. The target must make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw or immediately begin suffocating. That's essentially showing, like, okay, was he able to suck in enough air before the Blood Oil grabbed a hold of you, or are you out of breath and it grabs you by the neck and now you're in a really rough spot? I added in my own alternate suffocating rules, which is similar to concentration. It's whenever a creature takes damage, it's equal to 1/2 of the damage taken or a minimum 10, whichever one is higher. And then if they fail that Constitution saving throw, they begin suffocating immediately. And then that brings it into the Syringe. So what the Syringe does that makes it really scary is the Blood Oiler stabs with its long syringe appendage. Target must make a DC 13 Dexterity saving throw to dodge the syringe, which, if you remember from the Choking Grasp, you're not dodging anything. You are restrained. And so if you take this, I really struggled if it was just going to be this dexterity saving throw or if I should add a con. I personally have a design philosophy of 1 saving throw per attack just because I don't want to bog down combat more than it already gets bogged down. And so I'm just keeping it that dexterity saving throw. This oil is potent. And once it gets injected inside your body, you become paralyzed for 5d10 rounds, and if the target is a living creature and is dying, it becomes stabilized. They want to bring you back and turn you into one of them. And if the target is paralyzed and stabilized, the Blood Oiler will attempt to drag the target away, bringing it back to the pits where it can turn them into a creature of their own design. Looking at it, something I decided to add was fire vulnerability, which is just to go in with that oil catching fire as their hit, and radiant damage. Something I really liked is in Peter's 1 turn of combat video, it talks about the Reverend throwing a flask of holy water, which destroys its arm. I wanted to encapsulate that. It's also resistant to the piercing and slashing, but not bludgeoning, meaning that you can beat up on it with your clubs and even your fists if need be. And overall, I really wanted to capture that feeling of terror that you see inside of Tales from Elsewhere when one of these Blood Oilers walks out into the battlefield, and I hope that this brings that to you.
Well, this is obviously super cool, and I absolutely love it. And what's so fascinating is that both of these Blood Oilers still really do, they both capture the essence of a Blood Oiler, but in a different way. And they both are targeting different challenge ratings. This Blood Oiler, the one by August, is targeting the top of tier 1, we might say, and the one by Anthony is more of like squarely tier 2. So I could see Blood Oiler, just one of them, this version, as being the last boss of a story arc, because just one of these against a tier 1 party will be a nightmare for them. And then you bring it back 8 levels later, or 6 levels later, they're at the top of tier 2, and they're like, oh, we fought a Blood Oiler, that'd be easy. But now there's 3 of them. And that fight is now very, very scary because these are very deadly tier 4 creatures, and I love it. What I thought was really interesting that you did was you've baked in the Tales from Elsewhere combat system to a small degree here, which is fun. Adding in the player's ability to target the Blood Oiler's limbs in a bespoke way. It's housed within the stat block, as well as having a way for the Blood Oiler to take the limbs of the players. As one of the things I try to accomplish with Tales from Elsewhere is for the players to actually examine the biology of the creature and use that to determine how they fight it. And so with your rules and the choking grasp, the Blood Oiler snags somebody by the throat, starts choking them. That DC 18 escape for tier 1, really hard. But they might think, okay, grab the sledgehammer or grab the maul and power attack that limb, and if you can do 22 damage to it, the limb gets busted out. Maybe that's easier. So that's very cool.
Yeah, I really like how you chose to do like the lower level end of things with yours. I also did that with mine where I made it has no resistance to bludgeoning damage. One thing I did notice is I really like how you did 1d6 rounds instead of just saying 1 minute, because that makes it a lot easier in combat, because it's kind of a nightmare to try to quickly hold on, we got to figure out what the math is for how long 1 minute is in rounds. Yours definitely can sever limbs a lot easier than mine, but I almost like that. Mine does a lot more damage, so once it brings you to 0 hit points, it'll saw your limb off, but yours is like, oh no, it's gonna get you while you're still alive, which is scary. The menacing saw is really cool, and I did like how you did the limb vulnerability. That's definitely, yours and mine are very similar, but yours is just slightly different enough to be like unique. Surprisingly, it's kind of funny how ours have very, very similar hit points. Like mine only have 10 more than yours, but my CR is a little bit higher just because of the damage output. But yours is definitely, it's way more maiming than mine is. But it's cool though. I like it.
This one's gonna take more limbs more quickly for sure.
Yeah.
What I really like that you did is, just to highlight it even more, is the menacing saw is so cool. And if I could change one line on it, I'm just going to change perfection here. It's that they don't need to be within line of sight of the blade. They just need to be able to hear it.
Line of sound.
Line of sound. Because when I'm running the Blood Oilers, when I'm trying to build up the tension, you hear their saw blades first before you even see them lurking in the darkness. So that would be the one change, not line of sight, line of sound would be chef's kiss.
That's another cool thing I want to mention too, is like with 5e, we don't really get to play around with creatures like this, since this is it's supposed to be in a Western setting. So this is like almost a little bit more modernized technology, quote unquote, compared to like the fantasy setting, even though this is similar to fantasy. But I like the saw blade part, like that. Just like you just hear, what is that noise? We're in like this old lumber mill, and I hear from on the other side, and suddenly like they cut through a wall, and you see this giant undead with a saw blade arm coming after you. It's such a cool idea.
Yeah, that was something that was difficult when I was deciding what CR I wanted to make this creature, because ultimately, a lot of creatures in 5th edition at lower levels aren't going to maim characters. And so that was a balance point that I had to play on, of what point does it maim the characters, taking an arm, taking a leg, whatever it might be. And I decided to go all in. We're going Tales from Elsewhere. We are making it so, yeah, your character might lose their right arm, their dominant arm, in the first round of combat as it slashes through, getting a crit. And that just amplifies that horror aspect of the Blood Oiler. Watching the Paladin losing his arm in the first round of combat, oh, I would be like, all right, guys, it's been nice being a party. I'm out of here.
Get your spare characters ready.
We're going to be running into this Paladin later on in the campaign.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
Be a Blood Oiler.
Yeah,
Exactly.
using the familiar faces. Yeah, using the familiar face. Yeah. Yeah, the synthesis of these two together would make for an absolute nightmare of a creature in 5th edition. Like, it would be really hard with both of these put together to give it an accurate challenge rating, because its offensive abilities are just so high for whatever tier you're going to put it in, that most players are going to be ill-prepared for facing something like this, because it's not structured in the way that most Dungeons & Dragons monsters are. Maybe I think they should be structured a little bit more like that. But again, D&D isn't aiming for horror at this level most of the time, right? It's not trying to evoke these sort of emotions out of its players. But yeah, this one is awesome.
You bring that up, as that's actually something I wanted to keep into the stat block itself. Is it almost, I wouldn't say it death spirals, but it kind of death spirals. If you target that saw blade arm in the first 2 rounds of combat, it loses its main damage output. Now it has its choking grasp, which only deals 6 damage, but it has the option to suffocate, but it can only have 1 creature grappled in that arm at a time, meaning it now risks losing the other arm. And then once it loses that syringe, it's out of combat. So that's actually what I was looking at. Originally, I had this at CR3, and I bumped it up to give it a little bit more damage output. And then that way, the players can start snowballing it, taking out that saw blade arm or the syringe or the choking grasp arm to make it so it's not as deadly as it appears. I also avoided giving it a multi-attack for that reason, as much as I wanted to allow it to grab the character in the first round and then immediately start buzzing into them. I realized that was going to be a little too powerful for the level of play I was looking for.
Yeah, that would not be a CR4 anymore. No, that jumps it immediately into tier 2 so hard, because your attacks are much more likely to result in debility from the player, right? While Anthony's do more damage and has more multi-attacks, they don't result in immediate loss of limb or paralysis like this one does. Like you were just one misstep away and you're done. So yeah, giving this multi-attack would blow out its challenge rating immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
With mine too, also, like if you do start like destroying those parts on the Blood Oiler, its multi-attack is losing attacks with each part that you destroy too. So
exactly.
Like you break the saw blade arm, it loses that. It can't do this. It's just
I obviously love called shots type gameplay, shocker, I know. And I like the way yeah, I know, surprise. I think that it's trying to fit a little bit of that back into D&D can add a little bit of grittiness and a little bit more tactical play, especially from marshals, right? Who, if you're playing a character that's some sort of monster hunter, it's cool if they can like go up and, like you see in the movies, and he like chops off the saw blade arm, right, to neutralize its deadly thing, and then takes the syringe. It lets you do things that are a little bit more badass when you're just fighting with your sword and board or your axe.
A paladin doing a critting smite against my blood oiler would immediately take out that arm. It'd just be one clean chop. And now the player is safe from being choked out for another turn.
Exactly.
It helps with creative play too. So like with D&D, the biggest thing with a tabletop role-playing game is it's not a video game. There's not defined parameters of what you're allowed to do. So even if they don't cut the arm off, but they take like a jar full of some sort of like ooze-like substance, something like sticky, and they slam it into the saw blade arm and it jams it up and it disables it that way. Even that's something that like you said about called shots, whenever somebody new joins your D&D campaign, you can always see that light in their eye would light up and they're like, oh, I want to stab it in the eye, like, and then you have to kind of break their heart and be like, well, you try to stab it in the eye, but it moves and you get like real close, because it would be OP if you just, I'm gonna stab it in the eye, I'm gonna blind everything I fight. But the way I design my stat blocks is, if you want to do something similar, the option is kind of there just in case.
Yeah, I think that's why it's good to house that sort of special circumstance in the monster block, because D&D is not designed to handle called shots and maiming in that manner. It's you really have to bake it in at the ground floor to get it to be balanced, and it kind of throws a lot of things off. If you apply that everywhere in the system, it could take a ton of work. So housing it in the Blood Oiler stat block makes a lot of sense. But that is probably all the time we have to dig into this one. So let's move into our closing thoughts. Well, that was an absolute blast, and I hope that you, the viewer, have enjoyed this. So these monsters that we went over haven't been play tested, they're still fairly fresh. So if any of you get a chance to run one of the versions of the Blood Oiler, or both, definitely come back and let us know how it went. It'd be interesting to tweak the creatures and iterate them a bit and see what we can create from them. But if you are interested in homebrewing your own creatures or updating existing ones, definitely go to TTRPGenius and DM Dungeon Mastery. Their YouTube channels, they post once every other week and more regularly with shorts. Definitely join their Discords, which will be linked below. They're creating a ton of really cool, more deadly and interesting D&D monsters. So great way to spice up your games at home. And they're friends of the channel. They're really cool guys. So if you haven't already, go to their channels and subscribe. Because they're producing tons of great content. So, August and Anthony, any closing thoughts you'd like to share before we end it here tonight?
Yeah, I just actually want to thank you for letting me sort of tweak around with your creature that you've created and provided the art for. It was a blast taking a creature that wasn't in like a fantasy setting and turning it into a 5e monster, something that I don't get to do very often because I live in fantasy, so like that's my favorite thing is dark fantasy, but this actually kind of fits in, and I want to secretly take it and throw it into my campaign and scare my players with it.
I want to echo what Anthony said. Thank you again for inviting us on and letting us play with your monster. It was a blast. It got the creative juices going, and much like Anthony, I'm going to be throwing this in my next D&D campaign, as well as anything else I can think of for the other systems we play.
Well, thank you both so much. It was super fun. And if you, the viewers, have things you would like to see in the future, if there's other Tales from Elsewhere creatures you'd like to see these two guys have their hand at, comment down below, let me know, because these sort of collaborations are a lot of fun. Or if there are maybe some D&D creatures or creations of Anthony or August you'd like me to convert to Tales from Elsewhere, I'd also maybe be interested in that. So definitely let us know. And again, go to their channels, check them out. They're great stuff. Thank you too, and thanks everybody for watching.
Goodbye.